I can understand being anti-French. The French are a pretty silly people with the baguettes and everything. So let's talk about Niger. So there's been a lot of talk of coups recently. I mean, most recently, we of course covered the Wagner coup. I think it probably was more a mutiny. I think that's probably a better descriptor, but it's popularly referred to as a Wagner coup, definitely since the early days of those events were kind of blurred of exactly what the intentions of Wagner was. But now that we know that they were targeting Shoigu and Gerasimov and the Russian MOD, I think mutiny is a better descriptor, but that's something that people refer to as a coup. It depends on your interpretation of the events, which are still blurry to a certain extent. But we're talking about West Africa, specifically the Sahel, a very dangerous region with a lot of Al-Qaeda elements, a lot of ISIS elements that nations like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have been trying to crack down on and trying to defend their populations from, right? They've all taken different approaches to it, some more successful than others. And this region, partially due to that instability and other reasons as well, I can't get into all of the reasons, has faced a lot of military coups. I think Mali suffered 2 or 3 military coups in the last 3 or 4 years. Burkina Faso, similar as well. And Niger, even though this recent president that was just deposed from power, he was democratically elected and he came to his position of power through the democratic transition process, and it was the first leader in Niger's history that was democratically, transitioned into power. That means one president hands over power to another in line with Niger's constitution, right? That doesn't sound like crazy, amazing news as Americans, even though after the last 2 elections, maybe it does a little bit more. But that is very important for a young, flourishing democracy. For example, that's what happened between Petro Poroshenko and Zelensky when they transitioned power after Zelensky won his election in 2019, right? And that was a big moment for Ukrainian democracy because it was a show that Ukrainian democracy was evolving, was becoming stronger, and the election monitors reasserted this fact. And so a lot of people had actually thought that Niger was on the good path because in the last 2 years, I think, Niger, including during the nomination process and eventually the president that was just deposed, him getting actually installed in power, during that process, there was 4 attempted coups in the last 2 years, even during the process of him being put in power after he got elected. The time period before Biden got elected and then he was put in power, even during that time period, there was a coup that was stopped. And so after 4 stopped coups, I think back in May, the president of Niger in an interview said there's not going to be a coup in Niger, that there's 0 possibility of a coup happening. And while now looking back on that, we're like, haha, how silly, he looks like a fool. That wasn't exactly what everyone believed. Not everyone believed there was 0 possibility, but it did look more stable than Burkina Faso and Mali, where there were successful coups that overthrew the governments over there, that was condemned by the African Union, that was condemned by the UN, the EU, and this coup as well has been condemned by the United States, the African Union, the EU, every African nation you could probably think of that has commented on the effect. Actually, I believe everyone has condemned this coup outside of, I think, the Wagner group. Prigozhin released a statement. I don't think it's been independently verified if the statement is actually him or not. And you never know with Prigozhin, but I looked at it and it looked like it was from him. He was the only one that was actually wishing good luck to the people who overthrew the government. So what happened? Well, apparently the head of the presidential guard, Tachi, or I believe that's how you pronounce his name. I'm very, very bad with pronunciations. Let's see if we have his name, but I believe it's General Tachi. Yeah. General Tachi overthrew President Bazoum, who is the democratically elected government in Niger. And what's interesting about this coup is that Tachi is actually the head of the presidential guard, the people who are supposed to protect Mohamed Bazoum. And he was overthrown by the people who were supposed to protect him. What's particularly interesting about Tachi being the one to do it, the head of the presidential guard, which is like an elite military unit in Niger. He's been the head of the presidential guard since 2011. So he was there. He was actually appointed, I believe, by the person who democratically transitioned power to Tachi. And usually when the democratic government or any government transitions power, they put all their own cronies in place. But Tachi wasn't removed during this transition of power, not only because the last president, who believes his name was Fusu. I'm sorry, I'm very bad with all the pronunciations. I apologize. He was his pick for the presidential guard. The reason he wasn't removed during this transition process was that there was a coup during that period, and he actually saved Bazoum. And so I think that kind of contributed to a sense of security he had about how loyal the presidential guard was. So the presidential guard takes Mohamed Bazoum, puts him in detainment in the presidential palace. Then the rest of the military comes out and says, this is terrible. This is awful. You know, we democratically transition the government. The Constitution says he's the leader. We stand against this. Immediately release him. Immediately release him, or we will strike down you coups. Or something along those lines. That wasn't the exact words, obviously. I'm paraphrasing. Then a few hours later, they completely switch their tone. And they say, actually, this is dope. This is really cool, and we support it. And for about 24 to 48 hours, everything else is a blur. There's not a lot of communication about what's going on the ground. There's no communication about who's in leadership, who controls the country. There's some people who go out and protest in favor of Bazoum, the democratically elected president. Those protests are dispersed by the military by shooting shots in the air. Then other protests start after that are in favor of the coup. Some people have alleged, because there was a lot of Russian flags being flown there, that it could be part of a Russian disinformation campaign. I saw one person, I think they were talking to, I don't know if it was, I think it was Al Jazeera. They said that they believe that it could be possible paid protesters. I was a member of the German, I think, Social Democrat Party that was doing an interview with, I think it was Al Jazeera or DW News. Either way, it's all blurry. We don't know for sure how this coup was organized. The United States has said that, even though a lot of people are suspecting it's the Wagner Group, because the Wagner Group is going to have obvious interests in Niger, not only because Niger has 7% of the world's uranium production. It has, I think, the second most uranium in the world in Niger, or at least a very large amount of it. And the Wagner Group has a history of profiting off of mineral rights, trading their security benefits for mineral rights. That's what they did in the Central African Republic. That's what they did in Sudan with the Rapid Support Forces and gold. That's what they did with Syria and oil. Anytime they took a Syrian, quote unquote, liberated an oil well, they'd get 25% of the revenue. And so they'd have a motivation to do that here as well. Definitely, since they've also implanted themselves in Mali and Burkina Faso, which are neighbors who went through similar coups in the Sahel. They're right next to Niger. That's why also people look to Niger as kind of, a bulwark against these types of coups. In fact, the French moved most of their operations in the region, because this used to be French colonial territory and they still have a very deep relationship in the region. They moved the security infrastructure to Niger after the coups in Mali and Burkina Faso, and Wagner coming in afterwards, because they didn't trust these new coup governments. They wanted to move their security infrastructure somewhere safer and to continue to fight ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the region, in the Sahel. And now that's all put into question. Not only French support, but there's a bunch of other support as well. A lot of EU nations. The United States has thousands of troops there in bases as well, air bases with the French. They also have bases, the French. I believe there's even policemen that has been deployed, 200 policemen from EU nation states. I know the Belgians have, I believe, troops in the regions. I believe Germany has some troops in the region as well. So all of these, I guess you can call, if you want to call them peacekeeping forces, whatever you want to call them, I'm not going to morally load what they are. All of that is now put into question about whether that's going to stay in the nation, because the French government is condemning it as a coup. The American government is condemning it as a coup. The whole world is condemning it as a coup. So do you keep your soldiers there? Definitely, as the situation seems to not exactly be completely stable, and we don't know if terror groups are going to take advantage of this instability. We already seen that there's looting on the streets. We've seen fires start. How widespread that's going to be, we don't know for sure. I think that's largely motivated by the fact that a lot of people in Niger, and I did talk to a few people who have contacts in the region, friends of mine, because I don't have contacts in Niger. I'm trying to learn as much information as quickly as possible and building on the little bit I knew before. A lot of them are just confused about who exactly was in power. Now, with Tachi earlier today announcing that he's the head of the coalition, there's been a little bit more, transparency about the process, and people have more of an idea of who was in power. But even that came into question, because some people in this coalition now between the armed forces and the presidential guard wanted actually the chief of staff in the army to be in charge. And that's part of the reason why they didn't say to the public, hey, this is who our leader is, this is who our new guy is in charge of the coup for so long, because there was these internal divisions in the military which could bubble up. Let's say the army and the presidential guard, they start clashing about what the future of Niger should be, what the future of the region should be. They disagree, they start fighting in the street, and then that's a situation that Al-Qaeda, ISIS can take advantage of, and that could produce instability and not only endanger locals, but also foreign military personnel, foreign aid groups, which are also talking about pulling from the region, which is also going to be a massive blow to the humanitarian infrastructure that is set up in Niger. So it's a very, I would say, dangerous situation in the next few days on exactly how stable it's going to be, whether this coup military junta, and that's what it is, if I'm being completely blunt with you, military junta is going to be able to consolidate power and hold up against the entire international community, which seems to be rejecting their authority basically at the get-go. Whether or not they're going to be able to win over the support of the people, there's a lot of debate in the media about whether the people in Niger support the coup or not, because again, there were protests initially on the street in support of the presidential candidate that was elected, the Democratic guy who was couped, then they were put down. And then there was protests in favor of it, where they were waving Russian flags. Now, a lot of people are confused. Why are they waving Russian flags in the region? But like I said earlier, waving Russian flags in Niger. Like I said earlier, though, there are Wagner forces in Burkina Faso, there are Wagner forces in Mali, and some people in Niger, if you push away the speculation, and that's what it is, speculation about paid protesters, even though there certainly is a disinformation campaign in Niger being funded by the Russian government, specifically Wagner. They've been producing propaganda specifically to disseminate in this region of the world, not only in Niger, but Sierra Leone, Central Africa, Mali as well, trying to convince the locals that Russia would be a better security partner. There's a lot of anti-French sentiment in the region. There's a lot of sentiment that, you know, this is a new form of neocolonialism. We have so much poverty in our area, but we have so much natural resources. It's not a fair deal that we have with Western partners, and so we're going to turn over to the Russians. Now, I can understand being anti-French. The French are a pretty silly people with the baguettes and everything. I'm being facetious. But I would advise anybody, I don't know if I have any fans from Niger, but anybody who's thinking, well, maybe the Russians could give them a better deal, to remember the history of the specific organization they would most likely be working with if they worked with the Wagner Group in order to enhance their security. Not only because of the civilians they've killed throughout Africa, not only because of the sledgehammer torture and the beatings that they've doled out, not only because of the accusations of sexual violence and stuff like that, but also because they expect payment in mineral rights, as they did in Syria, as they did in Central Africa, as they did in Sudan. And so if there's a perspective that the Russians aren't going to try to have a neocolonial relationship, if you view the French relationship as neocolonial, that is, I think, a very, very, very silly outlook. And that does not trend with what Wagner's activity in Africa has been. Nothing is free at the end of the day. Nothing is free. And certainly Wagner security forces and security protection would not be free. Not only because of probably the humanitarian impact of having these war criminals that have been designated as a terrorist group in multiple countries because of their behavior, not only in Ukraine, but around the world, but also because you're going to have to pay up in mineral rights. And I don't know how much the people of Niger want to sign over uranium mineral rights to a private mercenary company designated as a terrorist group by multiple countries. I don't know if that's the smartest path forward. I also will say that the coupers gave like some reasons as to why they're doing this. I don't even want to have the article. I'm not reading any of this. I'm surprised I remember this information. I try to always stuff my brain as much as possible before I do these segments. The thing that gets me about the announcement of Tachi as the leader, they give a bunch of reasons as to why they're doing this. And one of the reasons is that they're using the military as a, like a personal security forces or militia for the president and not to fight against the terrorists. And that the security situation against Al-Qaeda and ISIS continues to deteriorate. But I don't really know if I buy that, definitely after speaking to more experts in the region, because if you compare how Niger is doing to Burkina Faso or Mali, which are dealing with many of the same groups in the Sahel, they're faring much better. A lot less of their territory is contested by these terror groups, so they have terror groups operating in this territory. A lot less instances of violence. They're a lot less, active in Niger, and it just covers a lot less territory. Actually, can we actually look at Sahel terror group map. Do we have any maps that can show where these groups are operating? Like a good map. I think DW had one. I guess this is good. This is not the best map, but this gives you a general
Burns
idea.
Is an immoral,
right?
Morally corrupt.
You see Burkina Faso and you see Mali here, and they're almost completely covered, or at least like 50% of the territory is covered. You compare that to Niger, it's not as bad, right? So I'm not saying that the president, the democratically elected president Bazoum, was perfect. Obviously, like when you're talking about this early on process of democratization, these people are probably going to engage in still some levels of corruption. There's going to be a lot of problems with these types of people this early on in the process. I've read about problems with this guy, but to say that this coup to install a military junta is necessary to increase the security situation when Mali and Burkina Faso went through the same process for many of the same reasons, or at least they claim was the same reasons. I think a lot of this is really about enriching and empowering these military leaders that they're trying to, like, you know, loot these countries through brute force and overthrow the constitutional, not only the constitutional order, because they have suspended the constitution in Niger, but also the democratic order completely. They have done that in Mali. They have done that in Burkina Faso, and this tough rhetoric of cracking down on the terrorists was given, and the security situation is not better than the situation in a democratically elected government, Niger. So I don't really understand how following in those same footsteps, or possibly down the road, none of this has been announced yet. We don't even know if the Western troops are going to be pulling out of Niger, even though there's, again, a lot of anti-French sentiment in the country and some calls for those troops to be removed. We don't even know if those troops are going to be leaving. But we see the path that Mali's taken in Burkina Faso, and it has not succeeded in defeating ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and the security situation has not improved in comparison to how they were performing before. Or if it has improved, it's been very marginal in comparison to how Niger is doing. So I don't think their claims in order to improve the security situation, that's why they're doing this, and this is going to improve the security situation. I don't buy it. Definitely, since one of the first things we saw after this coup happened and there was this confusion about who was in charge of the country was looting and chaos and a lack of trust in government control. People don't feel stable. And in that environment, that's how terror groups prosper. You don't even need to be an expert in foreign policy or any of this, any of this nerd stuff to understand that unstable country, terrorism like. Stable country, terrorism no like. Right? It's not that difficult to comprehend. The other reasons they gave were economic reasons, which I don't have the knowledge to really get into the nuance of, but I do have suspicions that it probably would be as, I think, as the narrative being pushed is as power driven or motivated by these military figures gaining power than it is motivated by actually improving the economy of the country, and that they actually have a game plan. And the reason I don't think they have a game plan is it took them like 48 hours for them to even announce who was the leader of the country. And in that period, the rioting happened. So I don't really even think they have a game plan to improve the country, because they, number one, took them so long to even say who was in charge. And number two, they haven't announced the game plan. They've basically released a list of complaints and now have announced to the world that they're going to take the pathway that other countries have taken that has not succeeded, right? This would be like if somebody looked at the American drug war and they're like, you know what? Let's try that here. That'll beat the drugs. That'll work. That's a very smart idea. Let's do what happened with the crime bill. That seems like a good idea. Let's import that to our country. Like, that's the exact opposite lesson you should be taking out of the situation. Exact opposite lesson. I don't really have much more to say besides the new military junta is making a fool of itself. One of the examples I can give is what they're playing on TV, or have been playing all day on TV, as everybody's confused and there's chaos and nobody really knows what's going on. This is what the state broadcaster decided to play on TV to soothe the people and make them, you know, feel at ease as chaos spread. I haven't seen beautifully bad green screening and music combination like this since like the Yugoslav civil wars. This is we're starting to compete with them, and that's an impressive feat. And I'm saying this was playing all day when they should be pumping out like, here's information about all of our reforms, here's our plan. It really feels like they went, grabbed power, and now they're looking around like, wait, I didn't think I'd get this far. Anyway, let's play another banger from the military.
Soja rukun maza, soja kaja muje. Soja kai ne kasa daji cikin sada waje. Soja kai ne kake shiga da gudu mugu ya fita a guje. Dan baka mai da sauki soja taron sada da gaje. Wasai dukan tsar na soja banga irin ka ba. Yaje matsoraci bai soja ba ya bugun gaba. Wanda ake kira namiji sai wanda ke shiga gaba. Sojin.
Yeah, no, things are not looking up over there, okay? Things are not looking up. And these videos got pretty trippy, by the way, okay? I'm not saying people should watch these videos and drip and drop acid, you know, like those people who used to watch the Wizard of Oz movies with I think it was I think it was Pink Floyd over it. They play Dark Side of the Moon while watching the not Wizard of Waverly Place. That was the Disney Channel show. You know, they would play the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon album during the Wizard of Oz, right? Yeah, it was the Wizard of Oz. I wonder if people could do that with this, because I'm just saying visuals are a little trippy. Weird situation in Niger. Obviously, this is terrible for the country. It's going to be terrible for the humanitarian groups, that many of which are going to pull out because of sanctions possibly placed by their home country, or because of the instability and not wanting their personnel to be in danger. This could mean the pulling out of the security forces in Niger. And if that's the decision of the local people, that's the decision of the local people. But if that's promoted by a government that is not even legitimate and was not democratically elected by the local people, and so they have to pull out for reasons outside of the people democratically chose in an election to expel those people, that's not necessarily a great thing. The possible growing of Wagner's presence in the country, as has happened in Burkina Faso and Mali, is concerning, not only for the locals that they could be hurting, but also because we don't want this disgusting organization to get more of a foothold anywhere. And it's probably going to be terrible for, I think, the daily humanitarian living, the daily living standards of people of Niger, as the economy is going to take a hit